Welcome back to the classroom. My name is Mr. Wong. Today we'll be covering Module 8, Applying Chemical Ideas, Inquiry Question 1, Analysis of Inorganic Substances, and we're going to be looking at a thing called complexation reactions. So to start off with this lesson, we're going to define what complex ions are and how they form, and then we're going to explain and describe how we can use these reactions to identify a particular cation or an ion component. Textbook reference, if you want to do a bit more reading, is here. Let's get started. Now, in this dot point, we firstly talk about qualitative and quantitative investigations. Just to get it out of the box and everyone knows what these differences are, qualitative investigations involve descriptive observations. So you're talking about color, you're talking about, any changes in appearance. Quantitative involves numerical observations. So you're collecting data, okay? Or you can be counting data, so to speak. So let's look at complexation reactions. Okay, so firstly, let's look at complex ions. You can see, depending on how different, metals or transition metals react or form precipitate with different anion solutions, or ligands, you can see that we have very distinct types of colors. Okay, each complex ion will have its own distinct color, and there's value to that because that can allow us to work out what the ions are what cations or anions are we dealing with in this particular solution. So let's first define what complex ions are. Complex ions are formed when one or more small molecule or ions attach themselves to a central cation, resulting in a complex property to specific species. Now this central cation is usually a transition metal, and the surrounding molecules or atoms are known as ligands. These ligands must have a lone pair of electrons. Okay? So here we have copper or tetrachlorocopperate 2 ion. This is an example of complex ion. Our central ion or cation is a transition metal of copper, and you can see it's attached by these ligands of chloride. You can also see that although we say copper 2, we haven't wrote the 2 plus here, we've wrote it outside the box here. This is to represent the overall displacement of the charge throughout the whole molecule. So let's look at what some common ligands are. Ligands are electron donors. They function as Lewis base pairs. You can look at these 3 examples of common ligands. All 3 will only form one covalent bond or coordinate covalent bond with the central cation. The way we work this out is you can see although water has 2 lone pairs, if it was to attach itself to say something like copper, only one of the valence or only one of the lone pairs would be facing the copper in the correct orientation. The other one would be facing perpendicular away from it, and so it can only form one. We have ammonia, so that can form one with the copper. We can also see with the example here of chlorine. Let's find our pen. Although there are 4 potential bonds we can create, it will only ever form one for that specific cation because the other ones would be facing in the opposite orientation. Okay, so a complexation reaction occurs when we have a complex ion or compound formed. So any ligand, being an anion or a neutral molecule, will donate its lone pair of electrons to form coordinate covalent bonds. So in this example here, we have the ammonia, NH3, okay, and it's donating its 2 forming, or this is an example of a covalent coordinate bond. it's donating its 2 electrons onto this hydrogen, and then to form this ammonia ion here. So that's what we have. So where are the transition metals? If you actually have a look on this chart here, the transition metals are basically in the center of the periodic table. You have a couple over here as well. Now, the transition metals are really valuable because they are all block D orbital elements. So in our third row here, all these are 3D blocks, and the unique colors we get from different transition metals comes from the block D splitting of the electron orbitals. So let's have a look at how that exactly works. You can see that for different transition metals or different metals, they have some really distinct colors that can form like so. We can see for the non-transition metals, barring zinc here, there is no distinct color difference, while as for these ones, there are some really clear colors that are given here, particularly when we use sodium hydroxide and ammonia. So what causes this complexation? So a complexation reaction can be used to determine what transition metal is present in a complex molecule due to the unique colors from the ligands that surround the central cation. Now, the reason why that's the case is because these bonds form when empty orbitals of the metal cation accepts lone pairs of electrons from each ligand. So say, for example, we have iron, and it becomes iron 3. So iron 3 plus, which is what we see down here. Once we've lost 3 electrons, we've opened some spacing for lone pairs of electrons to come and make bonds with the iron. In that process, it actually frees up the level 4 orbitals. So the single electrons in the third D level of iron are not involved in the bonding. However, the cation uses the 6 orbitals from 4s, 4p, and 4d level to accept lone pairs of water molecules. Now in total, and you don't really need to know the reason why, but iron can accept 6 water molecules to its composition to fill up the orbitals and to form ligand pairs. So in the diagram, you can see only one pair of lone pair of electron is shown for the water molecule. At the start of this lesson, we said that water has 2 lone pairs. Okay, but you can see when it bonds with iron, one of the lone pairs would be orientated in the wrong direction to form another bond with iron. Okay. The +3 charge is written outside the box, as you can see here, to represent a distribution of the charge now. As there are 6 coordinate bonds, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the coordinate number of this complex is 6 here. So what's actually happened is the 6 orbitals that have been freed up by the iron 3 plus cation has allowed for lone pairs of electrons contributed by the water molecule to enter into these empty orbital boxes, what we call hybridized orbitals now. So that's how the bonding works. So what about the origins of the colors? Okay, so in terms of the colors, how can we get all these distinct colors, and why would some be colorless? When it comes to working out the colors of complex ions, it comes down to a couple of things. Are there any ligands? So are there any ligands attached to our central cation? Is there any splitting of the d orbital, so the 3d orbital? Is there any electron transition? you would need these three criteria in order to obtain a distinct color. So something like copper sulfate anhydrous, which has no ligands, would be colorless. Anhydrous meaning by it's dehydrated. Now let's look at copper sulfate hydrous. So now it has water ligands. So what's actually happened when we put ligands in? Well, when we put water ligands in, we actually end up splitting the 3D shell, causing a separation. Okay? And then what actually happens is during that splitting process, there can be a transfer of an electron from a lower energy shell to a higher energy shell. And it's this transition that gives the distinct blue color of the hydrous copper sulfate. So remember, splitting of the 3D shell by the ligands can cause distinct colors. If we don't have splitting, no ligands, we might not get any color at all. Okay, so transition metals have different colors due to the splitting of the d orbitals by the ligands and the partial filling of the d orbitals from the electron transition. Ligands attached to the metal can cause large splits in the energy levels. So depending on what type of ligand we use, greater splitting is possible. So chlorine has the lowest amount of splitting. Cyanide, ammonia, can cause the largest amount of splitting. The bigger the split, the higher the energy we form. Okay? The lower the split, the lower the energy of light that is created as well. Let's have another look. So scandium, we can see that although the 3D orbital is empty, we have split the 3D orbital, but there is no electrons in the 3D orbital, and so there's no transitions. So in this case, there is no color, even though it has ligands in it. So if we're not seeing any electron transition in that 3D orbital, then we don't see a color. We also have zinc with a bit of ligands there. You can see that we have split the shell, or 3D shell. However, there can't be any transitions because the shell is completely filled. So that's why zinc cannot have a distinct color in this particular scenario here. Even though it has ligands, even though there's splitting. There's no transitions, you can't see any color change. Let's look at some really important examples that we talked about earlier in Module 5, and that's iron thiocyanate. So the color of the complex is dependent on the type of ligand the cation bonds with. So in this case, iron 3+ is attached with a ligand of thiocyanate, and it goes from a light brown color to a blood red color here. Okay, and so that's happening here is we're causing a splitting effect to occur. So what's happening, as we talked about here, we said the cyanide has the largest splitting, so it's going to absorb more of that blue light to migrate up, and so that's why we see red overall. Okay, so thiocyanate, you can see sort of the transition here. It goes from light sort of reddish or yellowish to a more reddish color, yellowish to reddish, and that's because during that transition from taking out one of the water molecules, which has high splitting, but we go to even higher splitting of the thiocyanate, it absorbs and provides us this really distinct red color because it's absorbing more of the higher energy wavelengths of light. Okay, another example we can look at is cobalt chloride. So cobalt chloride is blue. Cobalt hydrated with water is pink. So if you replace that with the chloride we said has a lower splitting. So if it has a lower splitting, the energy transitions are lower. So lower splitting, lower energy transition. So in that case, if it's a lower energy transition, it's going to need to uptake or absorb lower energy light. So if absorbing lower energy light, then what we would see is we would see more high energy light to be reflected back into our eyes. So that's why by introducing the chloride, we see a more bluish color instead of a pinkish color there. Because the pinkish color is disappearing because we're absorbing some of that red tone away. Okay, so if you notice the change in the coordination of the cobalt, the chloride ions are bigger than water, and there isn't enough room to fit 6 of them in. So chloride is actually much larger than the water molecule, so that's why we can only fit 4 chloride ions into here in comparison to 6 water molecules in this part here. If we add water to the right hand side, so if we add water here, there has an effect of moving the equilibrium to the left. The pink color of the hexa aqua cobalt 2 ion is produced again, only paler of course because it is more diluted. So that's what we see there. So what we're trying to talk about here is the significance of using complexation reactions, because different transition metals will have really distinct colors because of the splitting and transitioning of the electrons. We can even go backwards, and instead of working out a cation, we can actually try and work out an anion like chloride. So we could actually, in copper, tetra copper hydrate, we can actually introduce an excess amount of chlorine, and the structure of tetra chlorocopperate ion, this would be a sort of greenish tone color. So what we can see here is 2 different complexation ions, or complex ions, with very distinct colors. And so knowing what those colors are for the different structures, we can actually work out not only the cation involved, we can also work out the anion that forms that particular ligand. Alright, so that concludes our lesson for today. We have covered many different ways in which we can qualitatively identify inorganic substances. We talked about the flame test, we talked about precipitation, we also talked about complexation reactions. Remember, this is all qualitative. We don't use any numerical measurements. We simply look at the colors, we describe what the colors are, and we say what that is. Okay? So obviously it's a slightly different method to exact measurements, what we might look into a bit later on. But this is the method of describing colors and using those differences in colors to explain the cations and anions involved. I'm Mr. Wong, thank you for joining, and I hope you have a good day and stay curious.